Alright, so this is where we left off last video. We were just console.logging a string and a number. Okay, so for this video, we're going to be covering variables. And variables are probably one of the most, if not the most, important concept for any programming language. And if this is your first programming language, JavaScript, if you're completely new to coding or web development, what we learned in the last section, HTML and CSS, those aren't real programming languages. HTML is known as a markup language, even though if you type it in on Google, it actually tells you it's a programming language, which isn't completely accurate. It's code, but it's a markup language. You can't really write a software program with HTML. All it's for is for websites and for putting like text into a browser. Likewise, CSS is just a styling language. It only exists for HTML. That's all CSS is. So it's not a real programming language. JavaScript, on the other hand, is a full programming language. Like, you could do crazy things with JavaScript. JavaScript is used not just for web development, but you could write a software program. The Unity game engine lets you write JavaScript to make video games. So you could really do anything you want with JavaScript. And one of the most important concepts that you have to learn any programming language, any real programming language, not like HTML or CSS, is variables. So in JavaScript, you would create a variable with the keyword var, and then you have to put a space, and then after that, you put the name of your variable. So you can name it whatever you want. You just say name, and then you put an equal sign. And then whatever comes after the equal sign will be whatever your variable is equal to. So in the last video, we saw strings. So if you wanted to say the name was equal to Jesse, you can't do that. You have to put it in quotation. And then to end your line here, you don't completely have to do that. Like if I click run, this is fine. But you should always put a quotation, semicolon, not a quotation, semicolon at the end of your lines. They're not strictly needed like in other programming languages. Like if you coded with PHP and you left out a semicolon and you tried to click run, it would just there would be an error. It wouldn't let you see anything. In JavaScript, if you forget it, the engine just does it for you while it compiles. But it's still a good practice to always put your semicolons there. So variables are like used to keep track of a value. So let's just go back to console.log. And instead of console.logging a word like this, instead of doing that, we could do just the name. So now what gets console.logged is whatever the variable name is equal to. So it's equal to Jesse, so that's what's going to get console logged. It's the same thing, but now you're storing the value in a variable. So that means that through the program, albeit this program is not a real program, it's just a real 2 lines of code, but in an actual program, the variable could get changed. Okay, so that's basically how you would define a variable, and you could change it whenever you want. Just when you change a variable, you don't use the var keyword. You only use the var keyword when you're creating your variable. Once your variable is created, you could change its value at any time. So you could just say name is equal to a different value, and now when you console log, it's going to put the new value. Also notice that the name was first equal to a string, which is a string is, again, it's something that if you're not used to hearing, it's basically anything in quotes. Any word, sentence, a paragraph, anything like that is known as a string. There's basically 3 main types of variables. There's strings, numbers, and Booleans. And we're going to get to Booleans. Booleans are the simplest. I'm going to cover that before the end of this video. But so there's basically strings, that's one of these, a number, and then Boolean. And you could change the variable type to anything you want. At first, it's a string, and then I make it equal to a number. And JavaScript's okay with that. You could make a variable be any type whenever you want. There's a lot of programming languages out there that aren't like that, where they have type where every variable would have to be a certain type, and if you want to change it, there would be a bit of a process that it wouldn't be so easy as just like here we're just saying name is equal to number. It's that easy. Okay, so let's make a new variable. I'm going to delete this. Actually, first I want to mention the let keyword. So the var keyword is sort of like classic JavaScript, but a few years ago JavaScript had a huge update where they added a whole bunch of new things to the language. And one thing they added was new ways to declare variables. And one of the new ways is the let keyword. So you could say let name is equal to Jesse. And this is basically the same thing. It's still going to work the same. I'm not even going to get into what the difference between let and var is in this section. It's most of the time, almost 100% of the time, you could change var to let and your code will run the exact same. There is a difference, but most of the time that difference just doesn't come into play, and it's considered a good practice to use a let keyword instead of var. So I'm going to try to always declare variables with the let keyword, just so if you're following along, you get into the habit of using let instead of var. Okay, so let's cover a more like a better example of why to use variables. Right now we're just using a variable as a placeholder for a string. An example that I can give for why a variable is so useful is like for a video game where you have your game character and it has 100 health, and when its health gets to zero, you get game over. You could store his health value in a variable, and then whenever he gets hit, you could take away 10 points or 30 points or however amount of points from that value which is stored in a variable. So you could say let HP is equal to 100, and then when you're on screen, whoops, this is just resetting on its own, and then on screen while you play the game, you would see that your character had this amount of health out of 100. So it would say something like 100 out of 100. But this 100 is not just the number 100, it's actually stored in a variable. So it would say like HP out of 100. And this value would be replaced by whatever HP was equal to. So if HP was equal to 71, it would say 71. So using that, you could sort of keep track of something over time. And then if you just console.log HP, you see 100. And then you could make HP, equal to HP minus 30. And then it says 70. And then after that, we can copy this again. Minus 40, copy this. Then it shows 30. So you see that we're just using the same variable and manipulating it, and then using whatever its value is to console.log that value. Okay, so a Boolean. A Boolean is just a value that could only be true or false. So like a 1 or a 0, except it could only be literally true or false. So I mentioned, I think last video, I said that when you're console.logging, like right here, I'm not allowed to do this. I'm not allowed to put letters unless they're in a string. It'll be an error. You actually can console.log just the value true. Those letters used, just that's valid. Because JavaScript knows what this means. It's like a reserved keyword in JavaScript. So if you just try to add another E to the end of that, now there's going to be an error. So that's basically all Boolean is. You could say is Boolean is true or false, and that's it. Of course, you could just say Boolean is something else because JavaScript doesn't care what your variable is equal to, but when it comes to Boolean values, it could only be either true or false. And if it's anything else, then it's not a Boolean value, it's just a number or a string or whatever else. So let's just keep true. And if we just console.log is Boolean. It says true. Up here it says true. Okay, let me delete all this now. And another thing I want to show you is string concatenation. So concatenation, it's a long word. It basically is like adding a string to another string. So you could say my name is, let's just console.log this. So it just says my name is. And then after this, you go outside the quotes and put a plus sign. And then you could say name. And it says my name is Jesse. And if you just change this variable, you can change it to whatever you want. And it just sort of like combines the strings. And you could also do that. You could make another variable. Let's just say greeting. Whoops, greeting is equal to hello plus name. So let's go back here and put an actual name. And then inside here, we could just console.log greeting, and it will say hello Jesse. And if you do this, we'll say hello world. Okay, and the last thing I want to show you is the const. So I mentioned at the beginning of the video that JavaScript added a bunch of new things to an update a few years ago. It was actually like in 2015, I think, so it's a little while ago. They added a let keyword, which sort of replaced the var. They also added const. Now const is a lot different than let. You could probably imagine it makes a constant variable. So that means a variable that can't be changed. So you could say secret key is equal to, then in here would be your secret key for whatever it was, for an API, for like Google Maps, or something in your program that you were using that you knew as the developer is never going to change. So something like your name, that might not change. And if you know a value should never get changed, then you can make it a const. If you want to use it as an actual variable that will change, because that's what the word variable means, it means something that changes, then use let. But for an example like a secret key, and your key is always going to be the same, you could just do that, and other than that, it works the same way. So you can console.log it, and it'll show up here. But what you can't do is change the value. If you try to do that, there's going to be an error. So type error assignment to constant variable. Okay, so that's going to be it for this video.